Welcome to Land of Havilah. We'll read the entire book of Zechariah this time, and as usual, we'll break it up every few verses with some explanation. If the listener is unfamiliar with the Bible, it'd be better to start with any of the four Gospels. You can scroll down the Land of Havilah page or go to the web at landofhavilah.net for that. Then I'd read the rest of the New Testament, then go to the Old Testament, and eventually get here to Zechariah. We're reading from the World English Bible, as usual. Zechariah the prophet lived in Judah toward the end of Old Testament history, in the days after the Jews returned from the Babylonian captivity. Much of the book is a prediction of end-time events. The first chapter starts with a 6-verse section, which we'll read now, and then in our usual way we'll pause and explain. Zechariah 1, verse 1. In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, Yahweh's word came to Zechariah the son of Berechiah the son of Iddo the prophet, saying, Yahweh was very displeased with your fathers. Therefore tell them, Yahweh of armies says, Return to me, says Yahweh of armies, and I will return to you, says Yahweh of armies. Don't you be like your fathers, to whom the former prophets proclaimed, saying, Yahweh of armies says, Return now from your evil ways and from your evil doings. But they didn't hear nor listen to me, says Yahweh. Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? But my words and my decrees, which I commanded my servants the prophets, didn't they overtake your fathers? Then they repented and said, Just as Yahweh of armies determined to do to us, according to our ways and according to our practices, so he has dealt with us. Comment. From the place Zechariah started in verse 1, let's run the clock back and get our bearings. In the history of Israel, there was the Exodus, then the period of the Judges, then a long series of kings. The last king met his end when the Babylonian Empire conquered the entire area. They deported the Jews from their land and scattered them throughout the empire as slaves and servants. The Jews had no earthly hope that they could ever return to their old land and reestablish themselves as a nation, but for God. About 70 years after the exile, their big break came when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. Almost immediately, the Persian king issued an edict of release that allowed the Jews to return if they wished. Many of them took him up on it. As we arrive in verse 1 of Zechariah that we just read, it's been about 17 years since that edict. Some of the Jews have come back and are living in their land again. They still owe their allegiance to the Persian Empire at this point, to King Darius, as verse 1 just said. It's the 2nd year of Darius's reign. He ruled from the edges of Europe and Africa almost to what's now India. Believing Jews realized that the kingdoms of the earth were ultimately at Yahweh's command, that it's he who causes empires to rise and fall according to his will. Quote, he rules over the nations, Psalms 22:28. In verse 1, Yahweh's word came to Zechariah in the 8th month of the Hebrew calendar, which corresponds to October or November. Since it was Darius's 2nd year, that makes it 520 B.C., according to the NET Bible translation notes. The word of the Lord first came to the prophet Haggai about 2 months previously, Haggai 1:1, so Zechariah and his fellow prophet Haggai were very much together in the same time frame. At this time, the Jews were attempting to rebuild their destroyed temple and having many difficulties of it, Ezra 5:1 and 6:14. But this word in verses 1 to 6 wasn't about the temple. It was a very simple message that Yahweh expelled their forefathers from the land because he was displeased with them. But in verse 3 he says to the Jews, Return to me and I'll return to you. In verse 5 he asks, Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? It was a reminder that he ended their forefathers' lives miserably. And as for the prophets who tried to turn them around, they passed away too, of course, but it was in uprightness. In verse 6, Yahweh says his decrees overtook their forefathers. Speaking of Yahweh's decrees, quote, The word of the Lord is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, Hebrews 4:12. The Jews' forefathers whom he destroyed or exiled could have held tightly to that sword and wielded it to their awesome advantage, but they were on the receiving end of it. And so it is today. We can either cut a path for ourselves with that sword of the Lord or get cut down by it, Romans 11:22. In verse 6, after the exile, Israel repented and said, Yahweh has dealt with us according to our practices. 3 months after Zechariah received this word that we just read, he received another word coming up. It's not totally clear in the text, but everything from here to the end of chapter 6 seems to have come to Zechariah in one long vision of the night. We'll treat it as such, but we'll keep in mind that it could have come to him at separate times. If it was all in one night, he probably deserved the next day off. As the next verse indicates, the dream was 3 months after the word we just read in verses 1 to 6, so it's still the middle of the time the Jews were rebuilding the temple. Verse 7, on the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shabbat, in the 2nd year of Darius, Yahweh's word came to Zechariah the son of Berechiah the son of Iddo the prophet, saying, I had a vision in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse, and he stood among the myrtle trees that were in a ravine, and behind him were red, brown, and white horses. Then I asked, My Lord, what are these? The angel who talked with me said to me, I will show you what these are. The man who stood among the myrtle trees answered, They are the ones Yahweh has sent to go back and forth through the earth. They reported to Yahweh's angel who stood among the myrtle trees and said, We have walked back and forth through the earth, and behold, all the earth is at rest and in peace. Comment, there's some lack of clarity here for your narrator as to how many characters Zechariah is seeing in this night vision. For one, there's a man sitting on a red horse among myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him there are red, brown, and white horses. Then there's an angel speaking with Zechariah, which might be the same man. Zechariah calls him Lord, or it could be translated Sir. This angel's not Yahweh, it's clear coming up. Regardless of how many beings are in this vision, the overall message is simple in verse 11, that there's been a heavenly inventory of the earth, and the report is that the earth is at rest and peace. Now, speaking of Yahweh's angel among the myrtles, after he got the report, it struck him that while Yahweh is giving the world rest and peace, he's keeping Judah and Jerusalem in ruins. He wants to know how long it'll be before Yahweh withdraws his hand of judgment against the Jews and treats them more the way he's treating the rest of the world. Verse 12. Then Yahweh's angel replied, O Yahweh of armies, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which you have had indignation these 70 years? Yahweh answered the angel who talked with me with kind and comforting words. Comment, Yahweh gave the angel kind and comforting words, meaning he told him he intends to withdraw his hand of judgment against the Jews. Coming up, the angel will proclaim it to Zechariah exactly as Yahweh said it, and he wants Zechariah to go public with it. Verse 14. So the angel who talked with me said to me, Proclaim, saying, Yahweh of armies says, I am jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with a great jealousy. I am very angry with the nations that are at ease, for I was but a little displeased, but they added to the calamity. Therefore Yahweh says, I have returned to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, says Yahweh of armies, and a line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. Proclaim further, saying, Yahweh of armies says, My cities will again overflow with prosperity, and Yahweh will again comfort Zion, and will again choose Jerusalem. Comment in verse 14, Yahweh is jealous for Jerusalem and Zion with a great jealousy, which is a good thing because it means he's burning on the inside to do good for them. In verse 15, he's angry at the nations that are at ease. He was only a little angry at them at first, but they've agitated him to the point that he'll bring calamity on them. In verse 16, Yahweh proclaims his house will be built in Jerusalem. The temple project will be successful. A line will be stretched over Jerusalem in verse 16. All the way up to the modern day, the first step in a construction project is to stretch lines to show where the foundation will be. The stretching of a line over Jerusalem means Jerusalem will be rebuilt. In verse 17, the cities of Judah will overflow with prosperity. Instead of Yahweh being in judgment mode for Judah, he'll be in comfort mode. In short, there'll be a reversal of the fortunes for Judah and the rest of the world. Now coming up in the last 4 verses of the chapter, another phase of the dream. Verse 18, I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 horns. I asked the angel who talked with me, "What are these?" He answered me, "These are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." Comment, it's clear coming up that the horns are world powers. They've scattered and destroyed Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem like animals with horns. We get the image of a bull lowering his head and scattering and destroying everything in front of him. Israel was on the receiving end of it. Verse 20, Yahweh showed me 4 craftsmen. Then I asked, "What are these coming to do?" He said, These are the horns which scattered Judah so that no man lifted up his head, but these have come to terrify them, to cast down the horns of the nations which lifted up their horn against the land of Judah, to scatter it. Comment, Yahweh doesn't say who or what the craftsmen are, but their effect will be to cast down the horns of the nations in verse 21, meaning they'll give Judah relief from the foreign powers that scattered them. When the horns were on the rampage, no man lifted up his head. The only option an Israelite had was to duck for cover and hope he didn't get killed. But it won't be like that when the craftsmen neutralize those horns. Maybe we could visualize craftsmen removing the horns with saws. Bottom line, Judah will be prosperous and God will judge the nations who lifted themselves up against them. Zechariah 2 is next.